I thank the gentleman. How very appropriate today that this Congress is interrupting consideration of child welfare, foster care bills in order to address a gift for the nuclear industry. An indifferent Congress that refuses to put an extra dime in addressing the deficiencies of our foster care system doesn't hesitate for a moment in giving a few more $1 million to the nuclear industry. And isn't it amazing to hear what we will accomplish with a mere $16 million additional tax subsidy? Our national security will be protected. The first concern I've heard here on the floor in months from a Republican about giving things to Russia and China. Maybe the better place to look than this bill is down the street at the White House if the real concern is what we're giving to the Russians. And to hear supporters of this bill talk about the glories rather the dangers to Georgia and South Carolina, you would think that Sherman's march on Atlanta and South Carolina and Georgia was nothing compared to the harm this Congress would do if it failed to enact this bill. Well, the devastation that faces consumers in these states has nothing to do with what the Congress has or has not done, but it has to do with the nuclear industry seeking special treatment there, much as it is seeking taxpayer subsidies here today. It is an industry that has disregarded longstanding utility law to compel Georgians to pay higher electric bills for utility investments before they ever deliver 1 kilowatt of power. And they may, in fact, never get around to providing any power for all the money that is wasted on them. This is a bill that is masquerading as an incentive for the future, a glorious new day for nuclear power. And yet it makes this tax credit available to 20-year-old nuclear technology and for last century uranium mining. This bill hardly matches its cover. It's true that $16 million of additional help to the nuclear industry is a mere footnote compared to the billions of taxpayer dollars, taxpayer resources that have been lavished on this industry in the past. And in Georgia, the nuclear power industry literally turned decades of utility law upside down in demanding that electric ratepayers pay for what stockholders traditionally have paid for. And even after doing that, Westinghouse, a once distinguished American company, a blue ribbon company, went belly up. It's been nuked, and so have those local utility ratepayers. As the New York Times reported recently, quote, "Many of the company's injuries are self-inflicted. Bankruptcy will make it harder for Westinghouse's business partners to collect money they are owed by the nuclear plant maker. Now it's unclear whether the company will be able to complete any of its projects, which in the United States are about 3 years late and billions over budget. The cost estimates are already running $1 to $1.3 billion higher than originally expected, according to a recent report from Morgan Stanley, and could eventually exceed $8 billion right onto the shoulders of those ratepayers in Georgia and South Carolina. Of course, you would have thought that after the disaster at Fukushima and the many questions raised about nuclear power in Japan, that Congress would be rethinking nuclear power as a panacea. But even if you overlook this human disaster and the dangers to health and safety, a recognition that when the nuclear industry makes a mistake, it's a mistake that lasts forever. If you just look at the economics alone, this kind of tax subsidy is unjustified. With an ample amount of natural gas coming on the market, with so much renewable energy, nuclear simply has not made economic sense. And the history of this particular legislation demonstrates that. When this tax break was originally set up back in 2005, there were some 32 nuclear plants that were going to take advantage of it. And it hasn't been because of the failure of Congress that they didn't. Out of that 32, exactly 4 have even begun to be built. And not one of them, not a single one of them, has been completed in over a decade and a half. After this record of miserable failures, there's good reason to ask why taxpayers should be called on to give even more. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous, or Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter from 13 environmental groups expressing opposition to the legislation.
Without objection.
And I believe that there is an important additional concern raised by our colleague, Mr. Neal, already, and that is the fact that there are so many other measures. Do you have an additional minute?
I yield the gentleman an additional minute, Mr. Speaker.
There are so many other additional measures that colleagues, bipartisan efforts that are pending in our committee on energy-efficient residential property, on fuel cells, on small wind energy, on geothermal heat pumps, to mention only a few. These represent forms of energy and energy conservation that will help us address climate change while achieving our energy objectives. Instead of today's measure, our focus should be on safe, healthy forms of energy instead of an industry that costs too much and poses too much danger to humans. I yield back.